Hello everyone. Welcome to the Stand By Me Insights into the Use of Adjustable Workstations in Western Australia with Justine Leavy. This webinar is part of our Effective Workplaces webinar series, and we're glad to have you here with us today. My name is Tanya Hyde, and I'll be managing the webinar today. I'm the project manager with the Canadian Institute for the Relief of Pain and Disability, and this webinar is made possible through the support of the Community Grants Program through the BC Government, as well as through donations and memberships. While we wait for a few more participants to join us, I'm just going to run through some of the technical aspects of the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing with the audio or with the presentation, and we'll get to you an answer and try to troubleshoot those. And you can also ask any questions you have related to the presentation, and we will answer those during our Q&A session at the end. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted for free on our website within about a week. And the PowerPoint is also going to be provided for download. So we'll send you links to both of those items in about a week. As mentioned, I'm Tanya, and I'll be managing the Q&A session of the webinar. And our speaker today is Justine Leavy. Justine worked as a dental therapist in private practice dentistry in Western Australia for over 10 years before commencing an academic career at the University of Western Australia in 2001. She is taught at the University of Western Australia in Health Sciences and moved to Curtin University in 2008 to lecture in health promotion. Her current role at Curtin is as a senior lecturer in health promotion and a teaching research fellow with the Collaboration for Evidence, Research and Impact in Public Health. She focuses on evaluation of health promotion interventions, specifically in physical activity promotion and injury prevention, health-related mass media campaigns, and their design and evaluation with an emphasis on translational research. Justine, we're glad to have you with us today, and I will hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Tonya, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I've started my first slide looking at the beautiful new medical building that we have on the Curtin campus. So Western Australia is a very small state, and we now have 3 medical schools, and that's the beautiful new medical school at the Curtin campus. So I'm located in Perth, Western Australia, and it's the most isolated mainland capital city in the world, so we're a long way away from anywhere. The picture you have on your screen is where we're located on the west coast, and our beautiful skyscape of the city of Perth. I also live in Fremantle, so some of you will be aware that Fremantle may have some similarities to Vancouver. We're surrounded by the beautiful Indian Ocean and also the Swan River, nestled between the ocean and the river, and we have one of the most walkable cities in Western Australia. And some of you may also be familiar with the fact that Fremantle was famous for taking away the America's Cup from America, and it's where we hosted the America's Cup back in the 80s. And by way of background, and just to set the scene of how far away I am, I did notice that I had on my slide that it's Friday the 24th of March, but I think it's still Thursday, the 23rd of March for you guys. I'm heading to Vancouver in October, my first visit to Canada. I'm super excited about it, and it's a flight time of just over 20 hours to get there. So we're located a long way away, but I think we have some very similar interests in terms of health promotion and promoting physical activity, specifically in the workplace, which I'll talk about today. So as Tonya mentioned, I do have a PhD in physical activity promotion. It was mostly around evaluating a mass media campaign to increase physical activity in the general West Australian population. And more recently, I've been involved with evaluating injury prevention programs. I think that that ties in really nicely with your institute. In Western Australia, we have a peak agency called the Injury Control Council of Western Australia, and they deliver a program called Stay on Your Feet, which is designed to prevent falls injuries, specifically in West Australian adults aged 65 and 65 plus. So we've been involved with them over the past 4 to 5 years, looking at evaluating their programs not only for the community but also for health professionals, to see that the program, the way it's designed, the materials they design, the support they provide health professionals helps in trying to reduce the incidence of falls in elderly West Australians, and also with an emphasis on keeping older West Australians in their home and living independently. My other area of interest is drowning prevention, and I work with the Royal Lifesaving Society of Western Australia, and we evaluate a number of programs, specifically their Keep Watch program, which is around parental supervision and making sure parents are aware of the importance of CPR, and also Don't Drink and Drown, so a focus on young adolescents, and they tend to have a few drinks and then be risky in water activities. So hopefully my background ties in nicely with your institute, and what I'm going to present today will have some saliency for the listening audience. So I thought what I would do today is describe to you what are some of the adverse health outcomes of prolonged sitting. Sitting sits under the umbrella of sedentary behaviour, so I'll set the scene around what that looks like. List some of the health promotion workplace strategies that have been used historically to increase physical activity, and I'm sure that most of you will be aware that the workplace as a setting is a really appropriate place to try and target increasing physical activity. And then more recently, I'd say perhaps the last 5 years, there's been a real dedicated commitment to breaking up prolonged periods of sitting. And then I'm going to describe to you a program that we did that was funded by the Health Promotion Foundation of Western Australia, where we looked specifically at both the employee and the employer perspective of installing a sit-to-stand station in the workplace. And some of the findings that fall out of that are around the advantages, the disadvantages, the practicalities of sit-to-stand stations, and also some of the things around injury prevention and duty of care, which I hope will also be of interest to the audience. So firstly, I'll just set the scene around what is sedentary behaviour and how the physiological and physical activity literature describes it. It's usually described as activities that have a low metabolic or a MET range, and METs just stands for the metabolic equivalent, so the oxygen that's expended during the activity. So it usually ranges from about 1 or less than 1 to around 1.5. And if you want a comparison, if you think about what we expend when we're standing quietly, it's around 1.2 METs. But more recently, it's been proposed that sedentary behaviour should be restricted to non-upright activities, so thinking about those activities like sleep, and I think that is really highlighted really well when you look at what Canada's done with their new guidelines for young people and incorporating the notion of sleep. So more recently, a number of their systematic reviews have said that there are definitional differences around how people are describing what is sedentary behaviour, and I'm proposing that perhaps sedentary behaviour is the umbrella term, and sitting under sedentary behaviour we have a number of domains. And I suppose today we're going to talk about one of those domains being sitting time in the occupational setting. Sedentary activities include, as I've mentioned, sitting, but they also include a host of other activities, and you can obviously name them all off, like reading, meditating, relaxing, things like receiving a massage. We know that we spend a lot of time now watching television, Netflix, videos, all those sorts of things, using computers, talking on the phone, some of the computer games that we use lend ourselves to sitting for extended periods of time. We've also got the idea of riding in a car, driving and or being a passenger, and also the time we spend in sitting for transportation. So most of these activities, again, if we look at what the metabolic equivalent is, range from about 1 to just over 2 in terms of the metabolic equivalent. And as I mentioned, although it's there's some overlap, I don't think that we are now seeing sedentary behaviour and sitting time as being synonymous. They are now kind of being broken out, and when we look at the recent literature, people have done systematic reviews that look at the hazards of sitting time versus the health hazards of sedentary behaviour. So we're seeing the differentiation. And as I did mention, sedentary behaviour may exist in many contexts: occupational, which we're all very aware of, household. Again, the leisure time opportunity for us to be sedentary has featured pretty highly in the literature and in around what we've been exploring, and of course transportation. a lot of people live a long way from their work and they commute. In Western Australia, in some of the employees that we spoke to, you know, they had a commute of 1 hour into work. So the opportunity to be able to stand when they got to work was a really welcome opportunity. So I think these are important areas for us to continue to explore. But sedentary behaviour isn't something that's new. The relationship between sedentary occupations and health was first described back in 1713 by this guy, Ramazzini, who was probably well ahead of his time when he said, those who sit at work and are therefore called chair workers suffer from general ill health and an excessive accumulation of unwholesome humours caused by their sedentary life. So even though it's become popular in the physical activity research area, it's not something that's new. So it's been around and been posited for quite some time. And then if we go 200 years later in 1953, most of you will be familiar with the work of Jerry Morris, who reported that the bus conductors, so we're talking about the bus conductors in England in the old double-decker red buses, had significantly lower incidence of coronary heart disease than bus drivers. So obviously the bus conductor in those days involved walking up and down the bus, collecting money for tickets, whereas the bus driver predominantly sat for the whole shift. So Morris linked that the increase in the physical activity opportunity, or the opportunity to be active during work, was seen as one of the causes of the lower incidence of coronary heart disease in the conductors. And then for decades after this research, this was the groundbreaking paper which people focused on the benefits of physical activity, and they also didn't really explore the consequences of the sedentary behaviour until, as I said, just recently. So I thought I'd set the context about what's happening in the Australian perspective. And in 2004, Australia had some national physical activity guidelines, very similar to what we see in the rest of the high-income countries. That there was guidelines for 0 to 4s, 5 to 12, 13 to 18 and 18 to 64 years of age. But of course they were only national physical activity guidelines, and keeping with what was happening in the research field, we changed our physical activity guidelines to include physical activity and sedentary behaviour guidelines, and it was underpinned by a rigorous review, systematic review of the evidence that looked at the relationship between the common variables that we look at in physical activity, frequency, intensity and type of physical activity, and linked to the health outcomes. So they did that both for the physical activity and also sedentary behaviour, and came up with Australia's physical activity and sedentary behaviour guidelines that were introduced in 2013. But for those of you who work in health promotion and know that Canada has always tended to lead the way and be ahead of the pack, the Ottawa Charter, which is incredibly important to health promotion, is our underpinning framework for the way in which we often look at issues with a health promotion lens, and or use the Ottawa Charter to underpin how we might design and evaluate strategies, was developed in Ottawa in just over 30 years ago, 31 years ago in fact, in 1986. So Canada does tend to be ahead of the pack, and we always look to Canada. When I'm teaching, I always say to the students, have a look at what's happening in Canada. They always tend to be just that one step ahead of the Australian context in terms of health promotion. So I'm sure that some of you will be aware that in 2016 you were the first country in the world to integrate the behaviour guidelines for children and youth aged 5 to 17 to look at the amount and intensity of both physical activity, sleep and sedentary time for children and youth aged 5 to 17. And I suppose that shows your contemporary reflection in emerging the very cutting edge research and evidence and the important relationship between sleep, physical activity and sedentary behaviour. I believe now, and I'm sure that you might be able to confirm this with me, that Canada no longer distributes your older style physical activity guidelines because they're all under development, and that you're sent to the website to consult what the recommendations are. So I'll be really keen to look at what those future recommendations look for across the age groups and across the life courses you develop those guidelines. So the adverse health outcomes of prolonged sitting have been quite well established in the last probably 7 years, since about 2010. There's around about 15 to 18 systematic reviews now that look at what are the health outcomes, and as I mentioned, they've now been set out at how sedentary time may affect overall health, and they've also looked at how sedentary time may affect musculoskeletal health, mental health, so it's started to be split quite out. So overall, the key message is that systematic reviews have highlighted that excessive sedentary time is linked to overweight and obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease and premature mortality, and that time spent in sedentary behaviours is associated adversely with health risks which may be independent of the protective contributions of physical activity. And I think that that's really important and is a really important platform for public health messages, that irrespective of if we do find our 30 to 60 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity for the health gains that that gives us, if we are sitting for 6 or 7 hours a day, then there's going to be an imbalance and we're not going to get those wins of our physical activity. There's inconclusive evidence in adults for other certain outcomes, specifically some cancers, and also around depressive symptoms and some musculoskeletal disorders. But the literature, the review literature, tends to say that this, the opportunity to break up sitting time does have a positive effect on musculoskeletal disorders. However, there may be some repercussions with things around wrist injury if we're getting people to use a sit-to-stand station and it's not a good ergonomic fit. In terms of specifically occupational sitting or sitting time at work, it's also been shown in the reviews to be associated with cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, and there's a small amount of papers that look at it being associated with some poor mental health outcomes. And the most recent research suggests that if people sit for 7 hours or more, if they can just reduce their sitting time by just 1 hour, they have the potential to decrease their all-cause mortality risk by around 5%. And in the couple of papers that, in the papers that we wrote and also in the a paper I've just reviewed recently, they're showing that people are breaking up their sitting time by around 100 minutes using some of the sit-to-stand stations that are available. So that's a really promising outcome. So I think recently, in the last 5 years, there's really been an emphasis in the public health space and also in the workplace setting, and an awareness by employers of the importance of positing to their staff that they do perhaps need to break up their sitting time, and thinking about a number of strategies that could possibly break up sitting time, from both behavioural strategies through to environmental strategies, have certainly become quite popular. So in terms of health promotion, as health promoters, we use both behavioural and environmental cues to help try and change people's behaviour, influence their choices, make the healthy choices the easy choices, and also hopefully put cues and supports in place to sustain that behaviour change. You'll be aware that often if we promote people to be more active, or we ask them to increase their fruit and veg intake by something like a mass media effort, they might do that for 2 or 3 months and then they might revert back to their old habits and not sustain their behaviour change. So typically health promotion has looked for opportunities to make sure people feel supported and that they can continue to make those changes pretty easily. So the workplace has been a setting that's been used for a number of health promotion interventions, whether it's around being more physically active, promoting mental health, tobacco cessation, food and nutrition. It's really been a setting used really well by health promoters, and it's been used to promote physical activity, because often people will say barriers such as cost, lack of time, things being easy to access, you know, being too busy are the reasons why they're not active. So the opportunity to put health promotion or put physical activity projects or programs into the workplace has been one way in which health promoters have tried to promote physical activity. There was a recent review that said they looked at 58 papers and said that the majority of health promotion initiatives did look at using messages or information interventions. Some had a counselling and support opportunity, and some of them had a specific physical activity program that they ran. More interestingly, in the physical activity literature is the opportunity to use both environmental cues and office design. So thinking around having end-of-trip facilities available for staff, so if they do cycle in or walk in, you know, they can refresh before they go to work. Thinking of the activity permissive workstations and workplaces, so things like the walking desk, the cycling desk, walking meetings, and also the actual design of the office so that the stairs are in a central location, so they're not, you know, a stairwell that's out the back that's poorly lit, you know, that people aren't going to find attractive to use. So stairwells that are centrally located, stairwells that have music and artwork, and so people want to use stairs. And also thinking about how in larger buildings staff are located close to each other. So floors like human resources might be located close to middle management, so people just use the stairs to walk rather than taking a lift. So health promotion over the last, you know, 15 to 20 years has really pushed in the workplace the opportunity to make people more active. So the literature says that most full-time employees in countries like Australia and the UK and the US sit for around 80% of their total work time. Some work by researchers in the US said that people in full-time employment in the US spend about 9.2 hours of sitting, and another 2 hours playing computer games. So lots of opportunity to break up that sitting with some standing. Australians spend around just under 4.5 hours per day at work sitting, and then another almost 3 hours in leisure time sitting. So we spend a lot of our time in that sitting position. As we know, with labour-saving devices and the nature of the types of jobs we're now engaged in, most of us have got office-based jobs that involve not so much opportunity to stand up. And so, as I said before, this opportunity to break up sitting time in the workplace has been a great opportunity for us to do some research and see what it looks like. So, as I mentioned, it is a key setting. The evidence suggests that sit-to-stand stations are just one opportunity to break up that sitting time, and they have had, if you look at the literature, reasonably high level of acceptability, and once people have them in the workplace they tend to use them, and as I'll show in our results, if you take them away people seem to go into a period of mourning because they really get used to having that opportunity to stand up and break up their sitting time. Sit-to-stand stations have been associated with some improvement in employees' mood, and we'll demonstrate some of those findings that we had, and also in some musculoskeletal disorders. So really we think that the opportunity to break up workplace sitting is really important because it occupies the majority of our daily occupational sedentary behaviour. So we were lucky to be funded by Healthway, and Healthway is the Health Promotion Foundation of Western Australia, and it's been in Western Australia for quite some time now. And what happened was when the government placed a tax on tobacco, they said, what are we going to do with the tax? And they decided to take those funds and set up a foundation that would conduct and fund research into health promotion in the West Australian community. They also provide sponsorship for sporting clubs and other community clubs to promote things like healthy eating around sporting clubs, use the arts to promote healthy outcomes. And so they've been a very progressive foundation and have been a very welcome outlet for both our research endeavours and also for getting some funding for small health promotion programs. So they funded us to undertake this study called the Uprising study, and what we wanted to do was to explore sitting and standing in the workplace once we installed some adjustable workstations. And that's just a little example there on the screen of what the workstation looks like. So it was a mixed methods study. We collected both quantitative and qualitative data. We had a control group and an intervention group, and I'll explain to you what we did with our intervention group. And we conducted the study between March and September for a 6-month period in 2014 with office-based staff who were located across 2 locations in metropolitan Perth. One was the university setting, and we recruited participants for the intervention from not the health campus, from other areas on the university. So they weren't aware, or we hoped they weren't aware of the health implications of breaking up sitting, so that they weren't biased. And we also recruited some staff from a not-for-profit organisation located about 10 kilometres from the university. Participants were required to have a desk-based job. We didn't want anyone with any recent physical injuries or any musculoskeletal or pain or back disorders, so we wanted them to be relatively healthy and free from anything like that. Age between 25 to 54, and we wanted them to work at least 4 days a week so that we knew we could capture what we wanted to capture in the workplace setting, because as you're probably aware, a lot of people now choose to work from home for a period of time. We got consent from the participants, we got Human Research Ethics Committee consent from the university, and we also asked for the manager's permission for the employee to be involved in the study for 2 reasons. One, the sit-to-stand stations that we have used were a retrofit, so we did need to make a little bit of some damage to the desk, so we needed the permission that we might make some damage to the desk, drill a hole in it. And we also, as an important part of the research, wanted to interview the managers to see what their perceptions were around the installation of the desk. So this is briefly what we did. In week 1, the intervention group and a control group, we called for 20 in each group. We were donated by Ergotron 10 sit-to-stand stations, so we had 20 in each group for logistics and pragmatics. We asked them to wear an Active Pearl activity monitor. I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. And they wore it from Monday to Friday, just during work hours. So when they got to work, we asked them to pop on the Active Pearl. They popped it on their thigh. That was the best place to measure the transitions between sitting and standing. And they're also least likely, hopefully, if they're on their thigh, to get dropped in the loo when people go to the loo or fall off and get lost. We also asked them to complete a logbook of the time they spent at work, so we had a bit of a matching up of data from both the hard copy and the activity monitor. Well, after the first week, on the weekend, our properties people from the university went in and fitted the Ergotron desk or WorkFit sit-stand station to their desk. So you can just see here on the screen, it's clamped on to either the back or the side of the desk, and then it's got an arm that comes out and lifts up. Depending on whether the person was a dual or a single screen, we had the flexibility of fitting whichever screen was best for their workplace. This allowed them obviously to move the sit-to-stand station up and down so they could choose between sitting and standing whenever they liked. Each participant also met with a physiotherapist from the university who undertook an ergonomic assessment and ensured that they were correct in their standing position, the height of the sit-to-stand station, and any other queries that they had. They also received a brief one-on-one education intervention that was delivered by myself. It was adapted by some work done by a physiotherapist in Sydney who allowed us to use her package. The control group didn't have the workstations fitted and they just went about their usual practice. And then in week 5, we called both the intervention group, so the group who had the sit-to-stand station, and the control group back, and they wore the Active Pearl monitor for 1 week. So we asked them again, please wear the Active Pearl on your thigh, the same as you did in week 1, and please log your activities. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Active Pearl, it's just an accelerometer, so it gives us the ability to record the transitions between sitting and standing. It also allows us to record the number of steps they took, and in seconds, and then we convert it to minutes. It allows us to collect the time that the person spent sitting, the time they spent standing, and as I mentioned, the time they spent stepping. Active Pearls have been used in the physical activity literature and research quite widely over the last 10 to 15 years, and it's a valid and reliable measure. It's quite expensive. This little guy's about $600 each, so when 1 or 2 did get lost, that makes quite an impact on your study and your study budget. They also completed an online questionnaire, and the questionnaire looked at things around mental health. So we used the Kessler Distress Scale 10. We also asked questions from the short form 8 survey, and those questions were 2 questions around mental and physical health outcomes, and that's the person's own perceived mental and physical health outcomes. There's a questionnaire called the Workability Index questionnaire that some colleagues, Bowman and colleagues from the University of Sydney had used, and we got a copy of that questionnaire from them and used 3 of those items. We also took some questions. There's a project that also fitted sit-to-stand stations in the US called the Take a Stand project. We took some of their questions around the benefits of alternating between sitting and standing, and I'll show you those results today. And of course we collected some demographics around age and gender, and also height and weight to be able to determine the BMI. The findings that I'm going to present to you today are published, and Tonia's going to provide a link to those papers. So the first paper was actually written by our honours student who completed part of the project as part of her honours, and she reports on the quantitative findings, the accelerometer findings, and then my colleague and I published a paper last year on the qualitative findings around what the supervisors and the employees found, which I'll also present today and is available for you to read. So we did conduct both focus groups and one-on-one in-depth interviews. The focus groups were with the employees, and we did that 2 weeks after we removed the sit-to-stand station, because we really wanted to capture what their immediate feelings, thoughts, perceptions, the things that they liked and didn't like about the sit-to-stand station. That was facilitated by 2 researchers. The normal focus group methodology, we recorded it and then looked at the transcripts to get some themes, which I'll present to you. They were around 60 minutes in duration, and we thanked all the participants by giving them a $10 coffee voucher, so to thank them for their time. We also conducted individual interviews with either the supervisor or the line manager of all of the employees involved in the study, using a pre-prepared interview schedule. That lasted for about 30 to 45 minutes. 10 of them were face-to-face interviews, and 2, due to the logistics of where the supervisors were located, we did on the telephone, and they were conducted by 1 researcher, same methodology. We transcribed them and then identified the emerging themes, which I'll present today. So in terms of the quantitative results, we found that at baseline, both groups, so both the intervention group and the people who had were going to have the sit-to-stand station, spent an average of around 8 hours a day at work. And they spent just over 3/4 of their working day sitting. That equated to around 392 minutes. Just under 20% of the day standing, 5% of their day stepping, so really small amounts of steps, and coming in at 2,435 steps. And in the Australian literature, and also in the Australian sort of programs, we kind of promote that adults should be looking for around 10,000 steps a day, so that's significantly under. And they also had sit-to-stand transitions of around 26. At week 5, when we put the active health back on the intervention group and the control group, we found that the intervention group had reduced their sitting time by almost 100 minutes. So that was a really pleasing outcome. However, we also noticed that there was no significant differences between the groups in the time that they spent stepping, how many steps they'd taken, or the number of sit-to-stand transitions. So this was quite an interesting finding. It did, to us, it demonstrated the installation of the sit-to-stand station had increased the opportunity to stand up, but there hadn't really been any other changes. So if we look at that in a table form, here you can see we've got that decrease in sitting time, almost 100 minutes, and increase in standing time. So that was a really pleasing outcome. The other results that we presented on are also quite interesting, And our reason why we think that maybe we didn't get too many changes in some of these variables is the fact that it was a very short intervention time. So just 4 weeks really of having the sit to stand station, a very short one-on-one education program of like 15 minutes may have meant that we didn't get some of the findings that we hoped for. So there were no significant differences in mental or physical health outcomes between the intervention and the control group at follow-up at 5 weeks. The participants in the study, as I mentioned before, they were all employed in a full-time capacity. Most of them had completed a university qualification and they were in a married or de facto relationship. So generally the literature suggests that people with those sorts of attributes may be physically and mentally healthier than those who don't have those attributes, so that may account for some of these findings. And therefore we thought that maybe there was a bit of a ceiling effect, so that people already had quite high levels of mental and physical health at baseline, and therefore the potential to increase those in just that short time period may have been limited. Interestingly, there was a small but significant increase in the control group when we looked at the workability index compared to like an overall lifetime best rating. But once again, we have to be very careful when we interpret this because these were small group numbers, 20 in each group, and it may be that something was happening in the work outside of the workplace that may have accounted for that. Also what we thought is that once again these people were university employed. Some of them had a degree and they may have been generally more focused and productive and energised, and therefore this positive effect may have been reflected in their workability. So it was a small significant finding, but we must be careful when we interpret that finding. When we asked them the question about their perceived benefits of alternating between sitting and standing, they all said that they felt more energised, they felt more comfortable, happier, healthier, focused, productive and less stress. And when I show you some of the quotes that went with the employees, there was a real energy and enthusiasm, and they really embraced the sit-to-stand stations, and this comes out in their comments. So if we look at the results from the qualitative perspective to highlight and link back to the quant findings, as I mentioned, the employees were in the intervention group, so they all had the sit-to-stand station. The employers were the line manager, and we collected data from 17 employees and 12 managers. Again, just to highlight, the majority of the participants were female, had a healthy BMI, and also did have a postgraduate qualification. So when we themed up the findings from the employee perspective, we found that there was 4 concepts that came out, and they were the overall feeling of enhanced general well-being, the workability and practicality of having a sit-to-stand station. There were some definitive disadvantages of the retrofit, and I'll tell you what those were. And also there were some specific triggers that got people to stand. And I'll just have a look at, I'll just show you what those look like. People said that they felt physically better and it helped them mentally as well. The alternating between sitting and standing really helped with lower back pain. They felt better standing, they had less muscle tightness, they were more flexible. And again, someone said, I'm feeling so much more flexible, it's just really good to stretch your body. I feel more energetic, less pains in my back, my neck, more flexible, more awake by working. So they were some of the quotes that highlighted that they had this overall sense of their enhanced general well-being. In terms of workability and practicality, the employees were surprised that they could think on their feet and the tasks that they could do. They also said that they found that sometimes during the day they felt like they got restless, or they would start gazing or dazing off, and if they could stand, that would actually get their focus back and keep them back on track. They also highlighted the importance of the opportunity to exchange with colleagues rather than sending an email, get up and talking to people, or the flexibility to move around and have positive interactions with colleagues was a real plus of the sit-to-stand station. They said they had more people coming past to stop and chat to them, and they thought that they were that hadn't happened so much in the past. 6 participants commented on the tasks and the practicality, And some participants said that they were in an office on their own and they noticed that when they stood they swayed or did some sort of quirky things, so they wondered if they did share with someone if that would be a little annoying. So there was also some, the practicality of standing up also might have some consequences for others if you were in a open space or a shared space. There were definitive disadvantages of the retrofit. So the Ergotron has some play in the keyboard. So when you lift this section up, I've got one, and when you lift this section up, there's some definite play. And if you've got hard keystrokes, then there's some movement. So you have to be very maybe a soft typer. So some people said the temporary structure made the desk very unusable. It meant that there wasn't places to put paperwork out because this is taken up by your keyboard. There was a disconnect between where things were on your desk, and as some people thought that when it moved up and down it wasn't very comfortable. The other thing that people said was they didn't quite know where to put their chair, so that would kind of be sitting out in the centre area or to the side. So there are some disadvantages of the retrofit, and as I mentioned before, you do have to drill a hole and damage the desk. Triggers to stand were, people did download some of those timers that are available so that it'll prompt them to stand, or there'd be times during the day at morning tea or lunch, they'd pop it up when they came back, and people talked about the notion of being able to stand it up because then that'd help them push through the afternoon. Other people said they'd leave it up at the end of the day so it was ready to go in the next morning, people said that the people who shared an open space saw others standing, then they would also stand. So there were obvious cues that got people to stand. We looked at the supervisor findings and 5 themes emerged, and those 5 themes are listed here. Again, enhanced general health and wellbeing, engagement with work and the energy that it seemed to create, flexibility, and I think the 2 most important ones are the notion of employee morale and also injury prevention, which is probably key to most of our listeners today. Again, this notion of enhanced general health and wellbeing and the fact that it started a conversation around health, footwear, back care, which are important conversations to have in the workplace. Also observed that staff members were very productive. Staff members who had previously had a back issue or had some musculoskeletal disorders seemed to be more positive and more productive. And also the fact that they saw it as a health benefit, an occupational health benefit, and the fact that it improved overall health and wellbeing. There was the observation by supervisors that staff often needed to change their footwear. So whilst they were standing at their sit-to-stand station, they'd wear like their runners or their gym shoes, and then they might have their other kind of dress shoes if they had to go to meetings. So they did observe that. They said again that they thought that there was a real energy and a more positive engagement of their staff with their work. They observed that their staff seemed to be happier and more focused, that there was some positivity, alertness and sharper outputs from their staff. One supervisor did note that someone was easily distracted and their productivity decreased when the sit-to-stand station was installed, and then most of the time that person sat and never ever put up their desk. And they also thought that there were some scenarios where a sit-to-stand station in the standing position was less inviting, for example if people were receptionists or dealt with customers. They said that it helped enhance some of the strategies they already had in place for people moving more. So things around people use walking emails, so that reinforced the message of moving around. And they also said that they saw the opportunity to move more and increase incidental physical activity was a positive opportunity in the workplace. And I think these are the 2 most important findings from a supervisor perspective. They said that supervisors said that their staff were a valuable resource and they needed to provide a supporting working environment. The fact that staff spend a lot of their life in the workplace meant that they wanted to make sure that their staff felt valued and that they were an important resource. So they said they wanted to reward them by having that opportunity to stand, and that it shouldn't be that it was something just available for people with a musculoskeletal or back issue. It should be available to everyone. So it was about placing value on staff. They also said that they noticed a sense of mourning when the desks were removed, and in fact in 1 or 2 situations we had the opportunity to leave the desk there, and the staff were super happy and really jubilant that we were going to leave the desk there, and then when we did eventually have to take it away, they were really disappointed. We had a flood of sort of inquiries going, how do I get my desk back? The other important thing is around injury prevention, and supervisors definitely said that there are no negatives for getting the sit-to-stand workstation, except for a cost. You know, they often have to pay for that for their staff, but they saw it as important, as an important duty of care issue, and also would potentially reduce areas around injury for their staff. They didn't see that, although there is a cost implication, they didn't see that it should be an issue because the benefits far outweighed the costs, and they certainly saw it as the next workplace challenge that needed to be put on the agenda for discussion for upper management. So just to wrap up, because I'm mindful of the time and we would like to take some questions, overall the employees' perceptions were that there was increased mental and physical health benefits. It gave them the opportunity to be stretch, move more, and also the opportunity to interact with staff and use opportunities to get up and talk to people instead of sending emails. There was a real sense of increased energy and also perceived increase in their workability. And it was embraced by the employers. They definitely loved the opportunity to be involved in the intervention, and this is certainly consistent with the literature that says that it's a very acceptable strategy to break up sitting time. In terms of the supervisors, they really emphasised injury prevention and also employee morale, and I think that was the point of difference that came out from the qualitative findings from the employees' perceptions to the supervisors' perceptions. They really emphasised that their employees were a valuable resource, and they wanted to show that they could reward them or offer them something to improve their health outcomes. They saw it as integral to their duty of care, and they also felt that, consistent with the literature, that if employers have a high level of satisfaction with their work environment, then they're going to be more productive, and then hopefully they're going to have less sick days. Some of the other things that are key that came out was that it's important to have a role model or a workplace champion who's modelling this behaviour. Obviously, in all health promotion interventions, those that are more successful are multi-strategy and have a combined or a comprehensive approach. So there needs to be other things in place like standing meetings, walking emails, other cues to actions, steps that are available to walk up and down. And despite the initial cost outlay, they definitely thought that it was an opportunity to promote a supportive and inclusive workplace ethos. And they also said that there's a need for all staff to have access to, whether it's a hot desk that's a sit-to-stand station or sit-to-stand stations rather than just several special sort of considerations. The opportunity to stand goes beyond just health, but also is important in terms of musculoskeletal and injury prevention. Generally, simple tasks were completed. Emails, phone, when we talked to some of the people who have got jobs that involve reading and editing and things like that, they felt those tasks that included more concentration. They tended to sit down more. Data entry seemed for this sit-to-stand station not to be an appropriate task, and there were some things around it might not be appropriate to reception scenarios. And as I mentioned, there was a period of mourning on removal. So in the context of what we collected from both the qualitative and the quantitative research, we found that sit-to-stand stations seem to be effective in breaking up long periods of sitting in the workplace, and they certainly influence some health outcomes in terms of enhanced general health and well-being, and the perception that people felt like their productivity increased. We are the first people, to our knowledge, to explore both the employee and the employer perspective, and we thought this brought some fresh information to the literature, although I've just reviewed a paper for another journal and some people replicated what we did and found almost the same findings, which was really exciting to read their findings and almost see similar quotes from the employees and the managers. But as a good health promotion practitioner and researcher, it's just one potential strategy for breaking up working time, and you need an overall comprehensive workplace strategy for promoting physical activity. And what we see is these are important findings for both occupational and health promotion practitioners going forward. So thank you very much for listening today around our small study and what we found, and I'd also like to acknowledge Healthway for their funding, our research assistant who also completed her honours, and also to the sit-to-stand workstations who were provided by Ergotron Australia. And I'll now hand back to Tonya and take any questions and hopefully have kept within the time frame, Tonya.
Wonderful, you did great. Thank you very much, Justine. We do have a few questions. One is around, what was the cost of these sit-to-stand workstations, either on an individual basis or as a group?
Yeah, so they were sponsored by Ergotron, and they gave us 10 workstations, and some of them were dual screen and some of them were single screen. So they ranged in price from about 650 Australian dollars to about just under 1,000 Australian dollars. I believe now there is a lot of products on the market and therefore the price has come down, and the Ergotron does have some disadvantages. So the sit-to-stand stations that have the opportunity to be the full desk, and they also have like the little electronic control so that you can have it set and it always goes to one height and it's consistently at the correct height, I think are the better proposition than the adjustable sit-to-stand where you've got a little bit of play. But yeah, they were around 650 to just under 1,000 Australian dollars each.
Okay, great. And someone also asking, was an anti-fatigue mat required for the sit-stand?
Yes. Yeah. So we used our ergonomics advisor at the Curtin University to go and assess every person involved in the intervention, and one person did order in one of those anti-fatigue mats, and they also went and bought some different footwear because they couldn't wear their normal work dress shoes. So yes, they were used by definitively one person. I think maybe over a period of time other people got them as well, but that was a really interesting finding for us that I hadn't thought about, but a lot of people commented on you couldn't wear your normal dress shoes, that they had to wear like a good fitting exercise shoe. So that was an interesting outcome.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see, we don't have any other further questions, so I will ask for people who are online, if you have any questions, please type them in. I did have a question though. For people whose employers might be hesitating at the cost, other than referring them to your research and maybe watching the recording of this webinar, what would you have as advice for those people who are trying to kind of make the pitch, so to speak?
Yeah, well, it was really interesting because some of the supervisors who didn't have the sit-to-stand station, who saw what was happening in their office space, took their laptop and put it on top of the filing cabinet, or took their laptop. I don't know if you still have in Canada the old-fashioned telephone book that gives you some height. Yep. So they would make their own sit-to-stand kind of platform and popped their laptop up at a higher range. And then now some of those large organisations like IKEA, and I don't know if you have those sort of office work type big superstores, make quite simple transition platforms for you to put your computer on and get that transition to be able to stand. So modelling that behaviour using a relatively inexpensive modification, I think sends a message that people do want to stand more. They're making a statement about the fact that sitting is not what they want to do. So I think I'd go down the pathway of role modelling some of the less expensive opportunities, and also putting into the workplace, we have walking meetings. In one of our workplaces there is no chairs and low tables for a meeting. They're like those bar bar tables, so you have to stand up, and what we've found is meetings are shorter and more productive. So I think there are some opportunistic, inexpensive ways in which to role model and change the environment so people are seeing people want to stand.
Very good. That's really good advice. Did have someone who asked, did you find that the person who used the anti-fatigue mat then had introduced a manual handling hazard as they had to lift it on and off the floor whenever they wanted to move their chair in to sit?
Oh, I don't know that at all. I could certainly follow that up, but I don't know that at all.
Yeah, because that would be interesting too with that, needing to move back and forth between the two.
Yeah. Yes, I don't know the answer to that at all, but I could certainly talk to our ergo guy, Ron, and find out what happened there. I don't know that. So, Tonya, could you email me that question and I'll follow it up?
Sure.
So we did ask for, when we called for participants, we did ask for people that didn't have any musculoskeletal or back or neck pain or had any experiences, but in the study we did remove 3 desks. The reason for the removal was one person said they just couldn't stand how much play there was in the keyboard, and they did lots of data entry, and they said remove it, it is reducing my productivity, and we removed it very quickly. Another person rang and said, I've got acute neck pain since it was installed, so we removed that. And we followed up, and they said it resolved as soon as the station was removed, and we followed up to say, was there any other events that could have triggered that? And they said they reported that there wasn't, but we weren't quite sure why that had happened. And then the third person, we removed it because, now I can't remember why we removed it, but there was 3 that we had to remove. But as I said, after the study, people were ringing up and going, the person sitting next to me had one of those stations, how do I get one? We had just like an enormous amount of people requesting. And when we allocated people to the intervention or to the control group, the ones who were in the control group, we had a bit of, oh, that's not fair. So they really felt like they had been let down by not having the sit-to-stand station. So it was quite interesting, the conversations that opened up. And since we did the research in a university setting, more and more workspaces that have been redesigned or have been refit have hot desks that are the sit-to-stand option, and have in the meeting rooms the sit-to-stand desk where you can move it up and down by the little control button. So if you have a meeting, you've got the opportunity to stand or sit. So we have seen some shifts in our university.
Very nice. That's really interesting. Let's see. We don't have any further questions, so I think I'll go ahead and wrap it up. Oh, wait. No. Somebody did just send one in. Did any of the users of the Ergotron indicate they found the narrow keyboard tray meant they could not rest their forearms when keyboarding and had to modify their keying technique?
A couple of people did complain about where the platform sits. We didn't have anyone say that they had to change their technique, or we didn't have anyone say they had any wrist injuries or soreness. But I do know that a couple of people that used the dual screen, how it fit to their desk meant that the space between where they stood and where their keyboard wasn't the perfect space, and they felt like they had to do a bit of accommodating. So yeah, there was some limitations with the Ergotron and how they're set up.
All right, and there was another question. Was there any concerns mentioned in regards to people who had previous RSI problems?
No, because we didn't have anyone that had a previous RSI problem. I suppose that might be one limitation of this research, is that we really wanted them to have no pre-existing back, neck, wrist or musculoskeletal issues, because we didn't want to exacerbate anything or re-inflame anything. So it was interesting, because a couple of the comments from the participants retrospectively they then said, oh, I have had a few back issues and I found that this was really good, but they hadn't disclosed that when we called them for participating. So generally we tried to exclude anything that we could have reignited or exacerbated.
Gotcha.
The other person who's done some work for that person who asked the question, who's at our university, is Leon Straker, who's a physiotherapist, and he's done some work, quite a lot of work also around sit-to-stand stations, and he comes from a very musculoskeletal background, and there's a review paper which, Tonya, I could send you for people to look at, which looks at sitting time using things like sit-to-stand stations and what effect that does have on things like RSI and musculoskeletal disorders. So I could send you the link to that.
Great, that would be wonderful.